The mahogany conference table stretched between me and my past like a bridge I'd never wanted to cross again. I sat in the plush leather chair, my hands trembling as Attorney David Brennan read my grandmother's will aloud, his voice echoing through the downtown law office. The words seemed to float in the air. $12 million. The estate in Martha's Vineyard. My beloved granddaughter Sophia Chen. Until they crashed into me like waves against stone. $12 million. The house where I'd spent the happiest years of my life. All mine. I was still processing the magnitude of Nana Margaret's gift when the conference room door burst open. My breath caught in my throat as two figures I hadn't seen in 7 years strode in like they owned the place. My mother, Patricia Chen, looked exactly the same. Blonde highlights perfectly arranged. Designer handbag clutched like a weapon. That familiar expression of barely contained fury etched across her Botoxed features. Behind her lurked my father, Richard Chen, his once athletic frame now softened by years of corporate lunches, his dark eyes scanning the room with the calculating look of a predator sensing opportunity. "We're here for the reading," Patricia announced, not bothering to acknowledge my existence. "We're the deceased's family." Mr. Brennan adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and consulted his notes. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. The will specifically states, 'We're her son and daughter-in-law,'" Richard interrupted, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone that had terrified me as a child. "Whatever's in that will, we have legal rights as next of kin." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. "You kicked me out when I was 15. You told me I was no longer your daughter." Patricia's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Sophia. Still so dramatic. We had a little disagreement, that's all." "Teenagers can be so difficult." She turned to Mr. Brennan with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Children say all sorts of things when they're upset. A little disagreement." The words hit me like a physical blow, reducing the worst night of my life to a minor family squabble. I thought of the suitcase they'd packed for me, the taxi they'd called, the way they'd changed the locks before I'd even reached the end of our street. "Mrs. Chen," Mr. Brennan said carefully, "I need to inform you that your mother-in-law was very specific about her intentions. The will clearly states that all assets are to go to Sophia, with a particular note that Patricia and Richard Chen are expressly excluded from any inheritance." The color drained from Richard's face, but Patricia's composure never wavered. If anything, her smile grew wider, more dangerous. "Well, that's interesting," she said, reaching into her handbag and producing a business card. "Because we've retained Hartwell, Morrison & Associates to represent our interests. They seem to think we have a very strong case for contesting this will." Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. Even I knew that name, one of the most expensive law firms in the city. The kind of lawyers who specialized in taking things that didn't belong to their clients and making them legal anyway. Mr. Brennan accepted the card with professional courtesy, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Mrs. Chen, your mother-in-law was of sound mind when she drafted this will. She had every right to dispose of her assets as she saw fit." "Did she?" Patricia's voice carried a note of false innocence that made my skin crawl. "Because from what I understand, certain people had been filling her head with lies, poisoning her against her own family." Her gaze fixed on me with laser precision. "Some people are very good at playing the victim." The room seemed to shrink around me. This was exactly what I'd feared when Mr. Brennan had called to tell me about the inheritance. I'd known they'd come crawling out of the woodwork the moment they smelled money, but I'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that even they wouldn't stoop this low. "We'll be filing our contest within the week," Richard said, straightening his expensive tie. "Undue influence, mental incapacity, fraud. There are so many angles to explore." "And we'll win," Patricia added, her voice dripping with certainty. "Because blood is thicker than water, and courts understand that children belong with their parents, not with manipulative little girls who specialize in sob stories." They turned to leave, but Patricia paused at the door. "Oh, and Sophia, you might want to enjoy that house while you can. We'll be taking possession soon enough." The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gunshot. I sat in the sudden silence, my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling 15 years old again and utterly alone. "Miss Chen," Mr. Brennan said gently, "I want you to know that your grandmother anticipated this might happen. She left very detailed instructions about protecting her wishes." I looked up at him through tears I hadn't realized were falling. "Can they really take it? After everything they did to me?" His expression was grim but determined. "They can try. But your grandmother was a very thorough woman, and she loved you very much. She made sure to leave us everything we need to fight this." "What do you mean?" He reached for a thick folder I hadn't noticed before, its manila surface worn soft with handling. She spent the last 2 years of her life documenting things, collecting evidence. She knew this day would come, and she prepared for it. Evidence of what? Mr. Brennan's smile was sharp as a blade. Evidence of why you were really kicked out at 15. Evidence of what your parents did to you. Evidence of who they really are. He opened the folder just enough for me to glimpse what was inside. Photographs, documents, medical records. Things I'd thought were buried forever. Your grandmother never stopped fighting for you, Sophia, and neither will I. As I stared at that folder, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. My parents thought they could waltz back into my life and take everything that mattered to me. They thought their money, and their lawyers, and their casual cruelty would be enough. They had no idea what was coming for them. The memory hit me like a freight train as I sat in my car outside the law office, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. October 15th, 7 years ago. The night that changed everything. I'd been in my bedroom doing homework when I heard my parents fighting downstairs. Nothing unusual there. They fought constantly, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our suburban home like toxic smoke. But this fight was different. This one was about me. She knows too much. My mother's voice had cut through the darkness. She's been asking questions about the bruises, about why I can't work anymore. That guidance counselor has been filling her head with ideas. So what do you want me to do about it? Richard's voice, slurred with whatever expensive whiskey he'd been nursing that evening. Get rid of her. She's becoming a problem. I'd crept to the top of the stairs, my heart pounding as I strained to hear more. Get rid of me? What did that mean? Patricia, she's our daughter. Is she? The venom in my mother's voice made me flinch, because last I checked, daughters don't threaten to call social services on their parents. Daughters don't document every little disagreement with their phones. Daughters don't steal medical records from their mother's purse. The medical records, I'd forgotten about those. I'd found them weeks earlier while looking for lunch money. X-rays of broken ribs, doctor's notes about suspicious injuries, prescriptions for painkillers that never seemed to help. I'd been so young, so naive. I thought I was protecting her by hiding the evidence of what Richard did to her behind closed doors. I never imagined she was complicit in her own destruction. She's threatening everything we've built, Patricia continued. Richard, your mother already suspects something. If Sophia starts talking at school, if she shows those records to the wrong person. My mother loves Sophia. She'd never believe. Your mother isn't stupid. She's been watching us, questioning the story about my car accident. If Sophia confirms her suspicions, we lose everything. The house, the business, your inheritance, all of it. The business. Richard's consulting firm that was really just a front for laundering money through his mother's real estate empire. The inheritance that Patricia had been counting on for years, ever since she'd married into the Chen family. I'd been too young to understand the full scope of their schemes, but I'd heard enough whispered phone calls, seen enough hidden documents, to know something wasn't right. So what are you suggesting? Richard's voice had dropped to a whisper. We send her away. Tonight. Make it look like she ran away. Troubled teenager. Family problems. Drugs, maybe. We control the narrative. And if she tries to come back, she won't. Not if we make it clear she's not welcome. I'd tried to back away from the stairs, but the old floorboard under my feet had creaked. The conversation below stopped abruptly. What was that? Patricia's voice, sharp with suspicion. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Richard's face appearing at the landing, his eyes cold and calculating. Well, well. Enjoying the show, little bird? I'd run then, back to my room, but it was too late. Within an hour, Patricia had packed a suitcase with my clothes. Not all of them, just enough to make it believable. She'd sat on my bed while I cried, her face a mask of false sympathy. Oh, sweetheart, she'd cooed, stroking my hair with fingers that felt like ice. You've forced us into this position. We gave you everything. A beautiful home, good schools, all the opportunities a girl could want. And how do you repay us? By trying to destroy our family with your lies and accusations. I wasn't lying, I'd whispered through my tears. I saw the X-rays. I know what he does to you. Her hand had stilled in my hair, and for a moment, I'd thought I saw something crack in her perfect facade. A flicker of the woman she might have been before she'd chosen money over morality, security over her own soul. But the moment passed. What he does to me is none of your business, she'd said, her voice flat and emotionless. I'm an adult. I make my own choices. But why do you choose this? Because some things are more important than a few bruises, Sophia. Some things are worth the price. She'd stood up, smoothing her designer skirt. You'll understand when you're older. Family isn't about love. It's about survival, and you've become a threat to our survival." The taxi had been waiting outside. Richard had carried my suitcase down, his movements efficient and businesslike, as if he were disposing of garbage rather than his own daughter. "Where am I supposed to go?" I'd asked as Patricia handed the driver a wad of cash. "Anywhere but here," she'd replied. "You're a smart girl. You'll figure it out." The last thing I'd seen as the taxi pulled away was Patricia closing the front door of our house, the house that had never really been my home, and turning on the porch light, as if nothing had happened, as if I'd never existed at all. I'd had the driver take me to the bus station downtown. I'd sat there for hours, clutching my suitcase and trying to figure out where a 15-year-old girl with $43 and a heart full of betrayal was supposed to go. And then I'd remembered Nana Margaret. She'd always been the black sheep of the Chen family, the one who'd made her own fortune in real estate and refused to let anyone else control her life. She lived alone in her Martha's Vineyard estate, 3 hours away by bus and ferry. She'd always told me I was welcome anytime. I'd just never imagined I'd take her up on that offer in the middle of the night, with nowhere else to go. Now, sitting in my car 7 years later, I could still taste the salt air from that ferry ride, still feel the hope and terror that had warred in my chest as I'd approached her door. I'd thought my parents had taken everything from me that night. I'd had no idea they were just getting started. The Martha's Vineyard ferry had cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife through black velvet, and I'd stood at the rail clutching my suitcase and praying that Nana Margaret would answer her door. I'd never shown up unannounced before, never arrived in the middle of the night looking like a refugee from my own life. When the taxi dropped me at her sprawling Victorian estate at 4:17 a.m., every window was dark except one, the kitchen, where a warm yellow glow spilled across the wraparound porch like a beacon calling me home. I'd found her sitting at her antique oak table, still in her silk robe, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in her weathered hands. She was 73 then, but her dark eyes, so like Richard's, yet somehow completely different, were sharp as ever. "I've been waiting for you," she'd said simply, as if I'd merely been delayed for dinner rather than running away from home in the middle of the night. "How did you—" "Your parents called 2 hours ago." Her voice carried a note of disgust that I'd never heard before. "They wanted to know if you'd contacted me. Told me some cock-and-bull story about you stealing money and running away. Said they were worried sick." I'd started crying then, ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that shook my entire body. Margaret had risen from her chair with surprising grace and wrapped me in arms that smelled like lavender and safety. "Oh, my darling girl," she'd whispered into my hair. "I'm so sorry it took you this long to come to me." That first morning, she'd made me blueberry pancakes and listened without judgment as I told her everything. About the fights, the medical records, the way Patricia had orchestrated my exile with the cold efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Margaret's face had grown stonier with each revelation, but she'd never interrupted, never doubted my words. "I should have seen it sooner," she'd said when I finished. "The signs were all there. Your mother's accidents, the way Richard seemed to withdraw from family gatherings, the carefully controlled narratives they spun about their perfect life. You believe me, sweetheart? I've spent 60 years watching people lie for money. I know the signs." She'd reached across the table and taken my hands in hers. "Your parents are many things, but loving isn't one of them. They're users, Sophia. They find people's weaknesses and exploit them." "Then why did Richard marry her?" Margaret's laugh had been bitter as unsweetened chocolate. "Because she was pregnant, and her father owned half the real estate development rights on the North Shore. It was a business merger disguised as a love story." Over the following weeks, the truth had emerged in pieces. Richard had been struggling with his consulting business when he'd met Patricia at a charity gala. She'd been beautiful, connected, and desperate to escape her controlling father's house. The pregnancy, my impending arrival, had provided the perfect excuse for a quick marriage that benefited both families. "But they kept me," I'd pointed out. "If I was just a business arrangement." "You were useful," Margaret had explained gently. "The perfect family accessory. Proof that they were stable, responsible, worthy of trust and investment." Richard's clients loved seeing the family photos in his office. "Patricia used you for her charity work, the devoted mother volunteering at school fundraisers. And when I stopped being useful, they discarded you." Those first months at Martha's Vineyard had been a revelation. Margaret treated me like the adult I was desperately trying to become, involving me in her business decisions, teaching me about real estate and investments and the art of reading people's true intentions. She'd hired private tutors to keep up with my education, and quietly arranged for my school records to be transferred without alerting my parents to my whereabouts. "Knowledge is power," she'd told me repeatedly, "and the best revenge against people like your parents is to become everything they never wanted you to be." Under her guidance, I'd flourished. I'd learned about the Chen family business empire that Richard had been systematically looting for years, skimming money from Margaret's real estate deals and funneling it into offshore accounts. I'd discovered that Patricia's medical bills from her various accidents were actually payments to a plastic surgeon who'd been giving her increasingly expensive procedures. Most importantly, I'd learned that I wasn't alone. "You have options," Margaret had told me on my 16th birthday, as we'd sat on her terrace watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. "You can go back to them if you want. Try to rebuild that relationship. I don't want that. Then you can stay here, finish school, go to college, build a life that's completely separate from their toxic influence. What about Richard? Won't he try to claim some kind of parental authority?" Margaret's smile had been predatory. "Let him try. I have enough evidence of his financial improprieties to bury him in litigation for the next decade. And Patricia, well, let's just say her father would be very interested to learn how she's been spending the trust fund he set up for her." I'd chosen to stay, of course. The next 2 years had been the happiest of my life. I'd graduated as valedictorian from the local high school, earned a full scholarship to Boston University, and spent every summer working in Margaret's real estate office, learning the business from the ground up. My parents had never contacted me, not once. No birthday cards, no holiday calls, no attempts at reconciliation. It was as if I'd simply ceased to exist the moment I'd stepped into that taxi, which had made Margaret's warning all the more prescient. "They'll come for you eventually," she'd told me during my junior year at BU. "Not because they miss you or love you, but because they'll realize I'm not immortal. When I die, they'll expect to inherit everything. And when they find out I'm leaving it all to you instead, what do you think they'll do? Everything in their power to take it away from you. They'll lie, cheat, manipulate the legal system, destroy your reputation, whatever it takes." Her eyes had grown distant, calculating, which is why we need to be prepared. That's when she'd started collecting evidence, photos, documents, recorded conversations, medical records, a comprehensive archive of my parents' crimes and cruelties. She'd hired private investigators, consulted with psychologists, built an airtight case for why I deserved her inheritance, and they deserved nothing. "This isn't just about money," she'd explained. "This is about justice, about making sure that people who hurt children face consequences for their actions." Now, 3 years after her death, sitting in my car outside the law office where my parents had just threatened to destroy me all over again, I finally understood what she'd been preparing for. The war was just beginning. The courthouse steps felt like climbing toward execution as I walked up them 3 weeks later, my heels clicking against marble that had witnessed 1,000 other family battles. David Brennan walked beside me, his briefcase containing what he called the nuclear option, Margaret's carefully assembled evidence that could either save my inheritance or destroy what was left of my family forever. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, all dark wood and dusty law books that seemed to absorb sound and hope in equal measure. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with their team of lawyers, Patricia's designer suit no doubt costing more than most people's monthly rent. She looked every inch the grieving daughter-in-law, her makeup applied with surgical precision to suggest just the right amount of sorrow without ruining her camera-ready appearance. Richard wore his best funeral suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's service, the service I'd watched from the back of the church while he and Patricia played the role of devastated family members for the assembled mourners. His face carried that same expression of noble suffering he'd perfected for his business clients, the look that said he was a man of integrity facing unjust persecution. Their lead attorney, Harold Hartwell himself, was exactly what I'd expected. Silver-haired, expensive shoes, the kind of confident swagger that came from decades of taking things away from people who couldn't afford to fight back. He'd built his reputation on family law cases, specializing in inheritance disputes where wealthy clients wanted to overturn inconvenient wills. Judge Patricia Sandoval, the irony of her sharing a name with my mother wasn't lost on me, called the court to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with intelligent eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible variation of family greed. "This is a hearing to determine the validity of the last will and testament of Margaret Chen," she announced. "The plaintiffs, Richard and Patricia Chen, are contesting the will on grounds of undue influence, mental incapacity, and fraud. Mr. Hartwell, you may begin." Hartwell rose like a shark scenting blood. "Your Honor, this case is about a vulnerable elderly woman who was systematically manipulated by her estranged granddaughter. Margaret Chen was 81 years old when she died, suffering from the early stages of dementia, isolated from her family, and completely dependent on Sophia Chen for companionship and care. I felt my jaw clench. Margaret had been sharp as a tack until her final breath, her mind clear enough to run a multi-million-dollar real estate empire right up until her death. The dementia claim was a fabrication, but I knew Hartwell would have medical experts ready to testify otherwise. The defendant, Hartwell continued, gesturing toward me with theatrical disdain, deliberately poisoned Mrs. Chen against her own son and daughter-in-law, feeding her lies about their character and motivations. She isolated Mrs. Chen from her family, controlled her access to information, and manipulated her into believing that my clients were somehow unworthy of her love and inheritance. Furthermore, he said, his voice rising with righteous indignation, Sophia Chen has a documented history of delinquent behavior. She was removed from her family home at age 15 for theft and drug use, abandoned her education, and disappeared for months before showing up at Mrs. Chen's residence with sob stories designed to gain sympathy and financial support. Every word was a calculated lie, but delivered with such conviction that I could see the judge making notes. This was what money could buy, the ability to rewrite history, to transform victims into villains with nothing but expensive rhetoric and fabricated evidence. My clients are not seeking this inheritance out of greed, Hartwell concluded. They are seeking justice for an elderly woman who was taken advantage of in her final years by someone who should have protected her. They are asking this court to honor Mrs. Chen's true intentions that would have left her estate to her biological son, not to a manipulative young woman who saw dollar signs where she should have seen family. When he sat down, the silence in the courtroom felt oppressive. I glanced at David, who was studying his notes with the calm focus of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "Mr. Brennan?" Judge Sandoval prompted. David rose slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. "Your Honor, Mr. Hartwell has just provided this court with a perfect example of why Margaret Chen was so careful to document her final wishes. He has demonstrated exactly the kind of character assassination and victim blaming that my client has endured for years." He walked toward the jury box, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. Margaret Chen was not a vulnerable elderly woman. She was a successful businesswoman who built a real estate empire worth over $50 million. She was sharp, decisive, and absolutely clear about her reasons for leaving her inheritance to Sophia. The plaintiffs would have you believe that Sophia manipulated her grandmother, but the evidence will show that it was actually Richard and Patricia Chen who spent years manipulating and abusing not only Sophia, but Margaret herself. They will show that Sophia was not a delinquent teenager who abandoned her family. She was a child who was deliberately abandoned by parents who saw her as a threat to their financial schemes. I felt a flutter of hope as David's words began to paint the real picture of my family's dysfunction. But I knew the hardest part was yet to come. "Your Honor," David continued, "Margaret Chen spent the last 2 years of her life carefully documenting the truth about her family. She hired investigators, collected evidence, and built an overwhelming case for why her granddaughter deserved her inheritance and why her son and daughter-in-law deserved nothing." Hartwell was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Brennan is making claims about evidence that hasn't been presented." "Sustained," Judge Sandoval said. "Mr. Brennan, please confine your opening statement to what you intend to prove, not the evidence itself." "Of course, Your Honor." David's smile was razor-thin. "What I intend to prove is that Margaret Chen made her decision based on years of careful observation of her family's true character. I intend to prove that Sophia Chen was the victim of systematic abuse and abandonment. And I intend to prove that the plaintiff's claims about undue influence and mental incapacity are not only false, but are actually projections of their own behavior." He paused, his gaze moving from the judge to the opposing counsel table where my parents sat with their masks of wounded dignity. "Most importantly, Your Honor, I intend to prove that some secrets are too big to stay buried forever, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never truly denied." The battle lines were drawn. In the coming days, my entire life would be dissected, examined, and judged by strangers who would decide whether I deserved the love and security Margaret had tried to give me, or whether I would lose everything to the same people who had already stolen my childhood. Looking at my parents across the courtroom, I saw no trace of the people who had once tucked me into bed and read me stories. They were strangers now, expensive strangers, who would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was theirs. The war for my future was about to begin. The private investigator's office smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams, a fitting atmosphere for the revelations that would either save or damn me. Janet Morrison sat across from David and me, her weathered face bearing the expression of someone who'd seen humanity's worst impulses and stopped being surprised by them years ago. "Your grandmother was thorough," Janet said, opening a thick manila folder that seemed to contain the entire dark history of the Chen family. She hired me 18 months before her death, said she wanted to document everything before it was too late. What did you find? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Evidence of systematic financial fraud spanning nearly a decade, Janet replied, spreading photographs and documents across her desk, like a tarot reading foretelling doom. Your father has been embezzling from your grandmother's real estate company since 2015. Small amounts at first, a few thousand here and there that could be explained as accounting errors, but as his gambling debts mounted, she handed me a bank statement that made my stomach lurch. Withdrawals of $50,000, $75,000, sometimes more, all authorized by Richard's signature but traced to offshore accounts Patricia had established in the Cayman Islands. Gambling debts? David asked. Richard Chen has lost over $2 million at Atlantic City casinos in the past 5 years, Janet confirmed. Patricia knew. She even accompanied him on several trips, helping to establish relationships with high-roller hosts who could extend their credit lines. I stared at the photographs Janet was laying out. My father at blackjack tables, my mother laughing over champagne while chips disappeared in front of them, both of them living a lifestyle funded by Margaret's money, while I wore second-hand clothes and ate ramen noodles as a college student. But that's not the worst part, Janet continued. The financial crimes were just the foundation. What your grandmother really wanted me to document was the abuse. The next set of photographs hit me like physical blows. Hospital records from Patricia's accidents, broken ribs, a fractured orbital bone, bruises that formed patterns suspiciously similar to finger marks. But what made my hands shake was the dates. These injuries occurred while you were still living at home, Janet explained quietly. Your grandmother suspected that your parents were hiding domestic violence, but she needed proof. I saw some of these records, I whispered, remembering the medical files I'd found in Patricia's purse. That's why they kicked me out. I was getting too close to the truth and threatening their cash flow, David added grimly. If Margaret had discovered the abuse and the embezzlement, she would have cut them off immediately. Janet nodded. Your grandmother was devastated when she learned what had really happened to you. She blamed herself for not protecting you sooner, for not seeing through their lies. What lies? After you ran away, your parents told Margaret that you'd been having psychological problems. They said you were delusional, making up stories about family violence, possibly using drugs. They even provided fake medical records, suggesting you'd been hospitalized for a psychiatric evaluation. The room seemed to tilt around me, but Margaret took me in, because she investigated their claims and found out they were fabricated. The hospital they claimed treated you had no record of your admission. The psychiatrist who supposedly evaluated you didn't exist. Your parents had created an entire fictional narrative about your mental health to explain why you'd run away. David's pen was moving furiously across his legal pad. This establishes clear motive for undue influence, not by Sophia against Margaret, but by Richard and Patricia against both of them. It gets worse, Janet said, producing another set of documents. After Margaret died, I continued monitoring your parents' activities. They've been planning this inheritance challenge for months, well before the will was even read. She showed us emails between Patricia and Harold Hartwell, dating back 6 months before Margaret's death, discussing strategy for contesting the will. There were communications with questionable medical experts willing to testify about Margaret's supposed dementia, contracts with PR firms specializing in reputation management, even preliminary discussions about selling Margaret's properties before any legal challenges could be mounted. They were planning to rob her grave, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Essentially, yes. But Margaret anticipated this too. Janet smiled for the first time since we'd arrived. She installed hidden cameras throughout her house during her final year. She recorded conversations, documented her daily activities, created an irrefutable record of her mental capacity right up until her death. Hidden cameras? David's eyebrows rose. Did she record the conversations with Richard and Patricia? Every single visit, including some very interesting discussions about how they planned to handle the Sophia problem once Margaret was gone. The implication sent chills down my spine. What kind of discussions? Janet's expression darkened. Conversations about having you declared mentally incompetent, about challenging your legal resident status since you'd been living abroad for college, about finding ways to prove you were an unfit heir who couldn't be trusted with Margaret's legacy. They were going to try to have me institutionalized, among other things. Patricia in particular seemed very interested in exploring options for having you declared psychologically unstable, a continuation of the narrative they'd established when you were 15. I felt something cold and furious crystallizing in my chest. It wasn't enough that they'd stolen my childhood. embezzled from my grandmother, and abandoned me when I became inconvenient. They'd spent years planning to destroy what was left of my life, to take everything Margaret had tried to give me, and leave me with nothing but questions about my own sanity. The recordings are legally admissible? David asked. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, Janet confirmed. As long as one person in the conversation knows about the recording, in this case, Margaret, it's perfectly legal. She was documenting crimes being planned in her own home. David closed his notepad with a snap. This changes everything. We're not just defending against an inheritance challenge anymore. We're building a criminal case. What about the photos that made my father go pale? I asked, remembering the way he'd reacted when David had mentioned mysterious evidence. Janet and David exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Those photos, Janet said carefully, document something far worse than financial fraud or domestic violence. They document what your parents did to ensure you'd never come back, and what they were planning to do to Margaret if she didn't cooperate with their plans. What do you mean? Sophia, David said gently. There are some truths that change everything. Are you prepared to learn what really happened to you? What your parents are really capable of? I thought about the 15-year-old girl who'd sat in that bus station with nowhere to go, believing she was unwanted and unloved. I thought about Margaret, who'd spent her final years collecting evidence to protect me from threats I didn't even know existed. Show me, I said. The folder Janet opened next would either destroy my parents forever or destroy what was left of my ability to trust anyone. But I was done being afraid of the truth. The courthouse bathroom became my sanctuary between testimony sessions, the only place where I could allow my carefully constructed composure to crack. I stood at the marble sink, staring at my reflection, and trying to reconcile the successful young woman looking back at me with the terrified child whose story was being dissected in front of strangers. 3 days into the trial, and Hartwell was proving to be everything David had warned me about. He'd paraded a succession of witnesses designed to paint me as a manipulative gold digger who'd taken advantage of my grandmother's isolation and alleged mental decline. Dr. Gerald Hoffman, a psychiatrist who'd never met Margaret, but somehow diagnosed her with severe cognitive impairment based on medical records that Patricia had carefully curated. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a former neighbor who testified that she'd seen me arguing with Margaret in her garden, an interaction that had actually been me helping her plan new flower beds while we discussed my college courses. Most damaging had been Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, a geriatric specialist who claimed that Margaret's decision to leave everything to me showed clear signs of uncharacteristic judgment inconsistent with her previous family loyalties. The Margaret Chen I evaluated in 2018 was a devoted mother and grandmother, Dr. Chen had testified. She spoke lovingly of her son Richard and expressed concern about her granddaughter's troubled adolescence. The radical shift in her final will suggests significant cognitive decline and possible undue influence. What Dr. Chen hadn't mentioned was that her evaluation had taken place during one of Margaret's routine physical exams, not a psychological assessment, and had lasted less than 15 minutes. What she also hadn't mentioned, though David would reveal it on cross-examination, was that Hartwell's firm had paid her $75,000 for her expert testimony. But the most devastating moment had come when Patricia took the stand herself. She'd looked perfect, of course, a grieving mother and daughter-in-law whose only crime had been loving too much. Her testimony had been a masterclass in emotional manipulation, delivered with just the right combination of sorrow and righteous indignation. Sophia was such a troubled child, she'd said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We tried everything, therapy, medication, special schools, but she was always angry, always lashing out at people who tried to help her. Can you describe the incident that led to her leaving your home? Hartwell had asked. She'd been stealing money from my purse for months, small amounts at first, then larger sums. When we confronted her about it, she became violent. She threw things, screamed accusations, threatened to hurt herself if we didn't give her more money. Patricia's voice had broken convincingly. We were terrified for her safety and ours. The doctor said she needed professional help that we couldn't provide at home. What doctor? Hartwell had prompted. Dr. Michael Reynolds at Boston Children's Hospital. He evaluated Sophia and recommended residential treatment for her psychological issues. But before we could arrange it, she ran away. Every word had been a lie, but delivered with such conviction that I'd watched several jurors nod sympathetically. Dr. Reynolds didn't exist. Janet had confirmed that, but Patricia's performance had been flawless. And did she ever attempt to contact you after leaving? Never. Not once. We hired private investigators. We called hospitals and shelters. We even went on television pleading for her to come home. but it was as if she'd vanished. Patricia had looked directly at me then, her eyes glistening with manufactured tears. We didn't hear from her again until Margaret died, and suddenly she was claiming to be the primary heir. It had taken every ounce of self-control not to stand up and scream the truth, that they'd packed my bags, called the taxi, and changed the locks before I'd even reached the end of their street. That they'd never looked for me, because they'd never wanted me found. Now, as I splashed cold water on my face and prepared for the afternoon session, I tried to find some hope in David's confident demeanor. He'd been holding back during the plaintiff's case, letting Hartwell overplay his hand while quietly gathering ammunition for our counterattack. "Ready?" David asked as I emerged from the bathroom. "As ready as someone can be for character assassination," I replied. "Remember, this is where we turn the tables. Your parents think they've painted you as a troubled liar and Margaret as a confused old woman, but we have something they don't expect. The truth? Better than that. We have evidence." The afternoon session began with David calling his first witness, Dr. Amanda Foster, Margaret's actual physician for the last 15 years of her life. Dr. Foster was everything Patricia's purchased experts weren't: credible, thorough, and completely unsympathetic to my parents' claims. "Dr. Foster," David began, "you conducted a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation of Margaret Chen 6 months before her death. Can you tell the court about her mental state?" "Mrs. Chen was remarkably sharp for her age," Dr. Foster replied firmly. "Her cognitive function tests scored in the 95th percentile for her age group. She had no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other condition that would impair her judgment. In your medical opinion, was she capable of making complex financial decisions?" "Absolutely. In fact, during our appointments, she often discussed her business dealings in great detail. She was actively managing a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio right up until her death." Hartwell's objection about relevance was overruled, and I watched Patricia's confident expression begin to show the first cracks. But David was just getting started. "Dr. Foster, did Mrs. Chen ever discuss her family relationships with you?" "Yes. She was very concerned about her son's financial situation and his wife's injuries. She asked me several times about the patterns of bruising she'd observed on Patricia during family visits." "Did she share any specific concerns?" "She believed Patricia was being physically abused and that Richard was struggling with gambling addiction. She'd tried to intervene but felt her efforts were being rebuffed." I watched Richard shift uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't the narrative they'd prepared for. "Dr. Foster, in your professional opinion, were Mrs. Chen's concerns about her family based on careful observation or paranoid delusions?" "Careful observation. Margaret Chen was one of the most perceptive people I've ever met. If she suspected something was wrong, there was almost certainly something wrong." As Dr. Foster stepped down, I saw something new in my parents' faces, the first flicker of genuine fear. Their manufactured victim story was beginning to unravel, and they knew it. But David had saved the best for last. "Your Honor," he announced, "I'd like to call my next witness via video testimony. Due to security concerns, this witness will be testifying remotely." The screen descended from the ceiling, and suddenly we were looking at a familiar face. Detective Maria Santos from the Massachusetts State Police Financial Crimes Unit. "Detective Santos," David began, "are you currently investigating Richard and Patricia Chen for financial crimes?" "Yes. We've been building a case for embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud for the past 18 months. The courtroom erupted. Hartwell was on his feet objecting. Richard looked like he might vomit, and Patricia's perfect mask finally slipped to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Your Honor," Detective Santos continued as order was restored, "we have evidence that the defendants have stolen over $3 million from Margaret Chen's estate through fraudulent transfers and forged documents." Judge Sandoval leaned forward. "Detective, are you saying this inheritance dispute is connected to an ongoing criminal investigation?" "Yes, Your Honor. And we believe the plaintiff's attempt to contest this will is actually part of a larger scheme to cover up their financial crimes by gaining control of Mrs. Chen's estate." I felt the tide turning, felt the weight of years of lies and manipulation finally being lifted from my shoulders. My parents weren't victims. They were criminals. And finally, someone with authority was saying it out loud. But I knew David wasn't done yet. He still had one more card to play. The photographs that had made Richard go pale. The photographs that would reveal the darkest truth of all. The witness chair felt like an electric chair as I settled into it, my hands trembling despite my determination to appear strong. 3 days of watching my parents' lawyers systematically dismantle my character had prepared me for this moment, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of every eye in the courtroom boring into me like searchlights. David approached the witness stand with the gentle confidence of someone guiding a wounded animal to safety. "Sophia, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell the court about the night you left your parents' home." I took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. It was October 15th, 7 years ago. I was 15. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too young, too small for the gravity of what I was about to reveal. "What led to your leaving that night?" I overheard my parents discussing what to do about me. I'd found medical records showing that my mother was being physically abused, and they were afraid I might report it. Hartwell was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor." "Hearsay." "Your Honor," David countered. "This testimony relates directly to the defendant's state of mind and the circumstances of her departure, which the plaintiffs have characterized as abandonment. I'll allow it, but keep it focused, Mr. Brennan." I looked directly at Patricia as I continued, watching her perfect composure crack slightly around the edges. "My mother said I was becoming a problem, that I knew too much. She told my father they needed to get rid of me." "What happened next?" "They packed a suitcase with some of my clothes and called a taxi. My mother told me I was a threat to their survival and that some things were more important than a few bruises." "Did they tell you where to go?" "Anywhere but there." The memory tasted like betrayal and salt tears. "My mother said I was smart and would figure it out." "Sophia, the plaintiffs have testified that you were a troubled teenager with psychological problems who stole money and became violent. How do you respond to those accusations?" I forced myself to look at each juror as I answered. "They're lies. I never stole anything, never used drugs, never hurt anyone. I was a straight-A student who worked part-time at the library and tutored younger kids for free. The only thing I was guilty of was discovering their secrets." "What secrets?" "That my father was embezzling money from my grandmother's business. That my mother was being abused, but chose to stay because she was more afraid of losing her lifestyle than of being hurt. That they both hated me for being a witness to their dysfunction." Hartwell's cross-examination was a surgical attack designed to expose every vulnerability I'd ever had. He questioned my memory of events from 7 years ago, suggested that my abandonment trauma might have colored my perceptions, and implied that my close relationship with Margaret had been built on lies and manipulation. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you told your grandmother terrible stories about your parents in order to gain her sympathy and support?" I told her the truth. "The truth as you saw it as an angry teenager? The truth as documented by medical records, police reports, and financial statements? Alleged medical records that you admit to stealing from your mother's purse?" I felt the trap closing around me. "I didn't steal them. I found them while looking for lunch money." "So you admit to going through your mother's personal belongings without permission?" "I admit to being a child who was trying to understand why her mother had mysterious injuries and unexplained medical bills. And you never considered that there might be innocent explanations for these documents? Innocent explanations for x-rays showing broken ribs and orbital fractures, for prescriptions for painkillers and anti-anxiety medications, for bruises that appeared overnight and disappeared after long sleeves and makeup?" Hartwell's smile was sharp as a blade. "Miss Chen, isn't it possible that your mother was dealing with a legitimate medical condition that required privacy? That your accusations of abuse were the fantasies of a troubled teenager looking for attention? If that were true, why did they throw me out instead of getting me help? According to their testimony, they tried to get you help. You ran away before you could receive treatment. I wanted to scream, to rage against the careful web of lies they'd constructed around me. But I could see David's slight shake of his head, reminding me to stay calm, to trust the process. "Mr. Hartwell," I said quietly, "if I was such a troubled, delusional teenager, why didn't they report me as a runaway? Why didn't they call the police or social services? Why did they tell my grandmother I was dead?" The courtroom went silent. Even Hartwell seemed caught off guard by my question. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" 6 months after I left, my grandmother tried to contact them about me. They told her I had died in a car accident. I felt the weight of that lie settling over the room like a shroud. They held a fake funeral, had a death certificate forged, collected sympathy from friends and business associates, all while I was living 3 hours away, calling them every few weeks and begging them to let me come home. I saw several jurors shift uncomfortably. This wasn't the story they'd been told about the devoted parents searching for their lost daughter. "You have evidence of these alleged phone calls?" Hartwell asked, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Margaret recorded them. Every single one." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Patricia went white. Richard started whispering urgently to Hartwell, and I felt the first real surge of hope I'd experienced since this nightmare began. But David wasn't finished with his revelations. "Your Honor," he announced, "I'd like to play one of those recordings for the court." The audio quality was crystal clear. Margaret's voice warm and loving, mine young and desperate, begging for a chance to come home. And then Richard's voice, cold and final. "Sophia is dead to us. Stop calling, or we'll get a restraining order." The silence that followed was deafening. "Sophia," David said gently, "how long did you continue trying to contact your parents?" 2 years. Until Margaret finally convinced me that some people can't be saved from themselves. And during those 2 years, what did you do? I finished high school, got into college, started building a life that didn't depend on people who had already decided I didn't exist. Did you ever ask your grandmother for money during this time? Never. I worked 3 jobs to pay for college. I lived in the cheapest dormitory, ate ramen noodles for dinner, and bought all my textbooks used. The only thing I ever asked Margaret for was love. And what did she give you? Everything. She gave me everything I'd been missing my entire life. Unconditional love, respect, and the belief that I deserved to exist in this world. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I caught my parents' eyes for the first time since the trial began. What I saw there wasn't remorse or recognition or even anger. It was calculation. They were already planning their next move, their next lie, their next attempt to destroy me. But they had no idea what David was about to show them. The photographs that would finally expose them for what they really were. The courtroom felt like a tomb as David approached the evidence table, his movements deliberate and precise. He carried the folder that had haunted my dreams since that first meeting, the manila envelope that contained whatever truth had made my father go pale with terror. "Your Honor," David announced, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension, "I'd like to present evidence that will demonstrate not only the true character of the plaintiffs, but also the real reason why Margaret Chen felt compelled to protect her granddaughter through her will." Judge Sandoval leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. "Proceed, Mr. Brennan." David opened the folder with surgical care, removing a stack of photographs that he placed face down on the evidence table. These images were taken by private investigator Janet Morrison at Mrs. Chen's request during the final 18 months of her life. They document a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond financial fraud or domestic violence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched Richard and Patricia exchange panicked glances. Whatever was in those photos, they knew it would destroy them. "Your Honor," Hartwell interjected, rising from his chair with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for driftwood. "We object to the introduction of this evidence. These photographs haven't been properly authenticated, and their relevance to the inheritance dispute is questionable at best." "Mr. Brennan?" Judge Sandoval prompted. "Your Honor, these photographs are directly relevant to the question of undue influence. Specifically, undue influence exerted by the plaintiffs against both Sophia Chen and Margaret Chen. They demonstrate the real reason why Mrs. Chen felt it necessary to protect her granddaughter's inheritance. I'll allow the evidence, but Mr. Brennan, please establish relevance quickly." David nodded and picked up the first photograph. "Your Honor, this image was taken on March 15th of last year, 3 months before Margaret Chen's death. It shows the defendants meeting with a man named Vincent Kowalski at a restaurant in Boston." He handed the photograph to the judge, who studied it with growing concern. "Who is Vincent Kowalski?" "A private investigator who specializes in what he calls reputation management for wealthy clients. His services include everything from manufacturing evidence to intimidating witnesses to arranging accidents for inconvenient people." The courtroom erupted. Hartwell was shouting objections. Patricia had gone white as bone, and Richard looked like he might bolt for the exit. But David continued with relentless precision. "This second photograph shows a check written by Patricia Chen to Mr. Kowalski for $50,000, dated 2 weeks after their meeting. The memo line reads, 'Problem resolution.' My stomach dropped as the implications hit me. They hadn't just planned to steal my inheritance. They'd hired someone to eliminate me entirely." "Your Honor," Judge Sandoval said sternly, "are you suggesting that the plaintiffs hired someone to harm their own daughter?" "I'm presenting evidence of what they planned, Your Honor." This third photograph shows Vincent Kowalski conducting surveillance outside Sophia Chen's college dormitory in Boston. He was specifically tasked with documenting her daily routines and identifying vulnerabilities. I felt the world tilting around me. While I'd been studying for exams and worrying about normal college problems, my parents had hired a professional to stalk me, to map out my life in preparation for what? David continued his methodical destruction of my parents' facade. This fourth photograph shows a meeting between Richard Chen and Dr. Franklin Morris, a psychiatrist who has since lost his license for falsifying medical records. Dr. Morris was paid $15,000 to create a fictional psychiatric history for Sophia Chen, documenting supposed mental illness and suicidal tendencies. The purpose being to provide legal justification for having Sophia involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility where she would be heavily medicated and declared incompetent to inherit anything. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Not only had they planned to have me killed or disappeared, they'd created a backup plan to have me locked away in a mental institution, drugged into compliance, and legally erased from existence. Your Honor, Hartwell was practically screaming now. This is outrageous speculation based on circumstantial— Mr. Hartwell, you'll have your chance to cross-examine. Judge Sandoval cut him off. Mr. Brennan, continue. David picked up another photograph, and I saw Richard visibly flinch. This image shows Patricia Chen meeting with a funeral director in Springfield, Massachusetts. She was pricing cremation services and discussing how to arrange a funeral without a body. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her face pale with shock. They were planning my murder, I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. Your Honor, David said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. These photographs document a conspiracy to murder Margaret Chen's granddaughter in order to ensure that the defendants would inherit her estate. When Margaret learned of this plot, how did she learn of it? Judge Sandoval interrupted. David smiled grimly. Because Vincent Kowalski made a critical mistake. He tried to recruit Margaret's housekeeper, Elena Rodriguez, to provide inside information about both Margaret and Sophia's schedules. Elena reported the approach to Margaret immediately. And what did Mrs. Chen do with this information? She hired her own security team to protect Sophia while secretly gathering evidence of the conspiracy. She also accelerated her estate planning to ensure that even if something happened to her, Sophia would be protected. I felt tears streaming down my face as the full scope of Margaret's love and protection became clear. She hadn't just left me money. She'd literally saved my life. Your Honor, David continued, the final photograph in this series shows Richard and Patricia Chen meeting with a representative from the Hartwell firm 6 months before Margaret's death, planning this very inheritance challenge. They weren't grieving family members shocked by an unexpected will. They were criminals whose murder plot had been exposed, scrambling to find a legal way to steal what they'd planned to take through violence. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Reporters were frantically taking notes. Jurors were staring at my parents in horror, and Hartwell was screaming about inadmissible evidence and character assassination. But through it all, I kept staring at Richard and Patricia, these people who had given me life, and then spent years planning to take it away. They weren't just bad parents. They were monsters wearing human faces, capable of discussing the murder of their own daughter over dinner as casually as planning a vacation. Your Honor, Detective Santos's voice came through the video connection. Based on this evidence, we will be filing charges against Richard and Patricia Chen for conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted murder for hire. Richard finally broke. He lurched to his feet, his face contorted with rage and desperation. She's not even our daughter, he screamed. Why should that little bitch get everything when she's not even blood? The words hit the courtroom like a bomb, and I felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. Not even their daughter. Everything finally made sense. The silence that followed Richard's outburst was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. His words echoed through the courtroom. She's not even our daughter. Hanging in the air like poison gas, toxic and inescapable. Judge Sandoval leaned forward, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet. Mr. Chen, did you just state that Sophia Chen is not your biological daughter? Richard stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of panic, rage, and desperate calculation. Patricia grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit, but it was too late. The truth had escaped, and like blood in water, it was already spreading. Richard's voice cracked. I didn't mean— That's not what Your Honor, David said, his voice steady as granite. This revelation explains the final piece of evidence we need to present. He reached into the folder again, his movements deliberate and careful. The photographs that truly terrified the defendants. My hands clenched in my lap as David lifted a manila envelope from the bottom of the folder. Whatever was inside had been kept separate from the other evidence, sealed away like something too dangerous for casual handling. These images, David continued, document not just a murder conspiracy, but the motive behind it, a secret that Richard and Patricia Chen have been hiding for 22 years. He opened the envelope and removed a single photograph, studying it for a moment before handing it to Judge Sandoval. Her eyebrows rose as she examined the image. Mr. Brennan, what am I looking at? A birth certificate, Your Honor. Sophia Chen's original birth certificate, filed at Boston General Hospital on April 3, 2001. the document that Richard and Patricia Chen thought they had destroyed. My world tilted on its axis. I stared at David, trying to process what he was saying. My birth certificate? The real one, Sophia, not the amended version your parents filed later. He handed me a copy, and I felt the paper trembling in my hands as I read words that redefined my entire existence. Mother, Patricia Chen. Father, Margaret Chen's business partner, Thomas Morgan. Thomas Morgan, not Richard Chen. The name meant nothing to me, but as I looked up, I saw recognition and terror dawn in my parents' faces. Your Honor, David explained. 22 years ago, Patricia Chen was having an affair with Thomas Morgan, Margaret Chen's business partner and closest friend. When she became pregnant, she convinced Richard to marry her and claim the child as his own. Why would he agree to that? Judge Sandoval asked. Because Thomas Morgan was worth $40 million, and Margaret Chen had made it clear that if Patricia's affair became public, it would destroy both her business partnership with Morgan and her relationship with her son. Richard saw an opportunity to secure his position in the family business by saving his mother from the scandal. I felt sick as the pieces fell into place. I wasn't Richard's daughter. I was the product of an affair that had been covered up to protect money and reputation. My entire life had been built on a lie. But Margaret found out, I said, the words emerging as barely a whisper. David nodded grimly. Margaret discovered the truth 3 years ago when she had genetic testing done for her estate planning. She realized that Sophia wasn't Richard's biological daughter, which explained why she'd always felt such a strong connection to her. Sophia reminded her of Thomas Morgan, the man who had been like a brother to her. What happened to Thomas Morgan? Judge Sandoval asked. He died in a car accident 6 months after Sophia was born. A car accident that occurred just 3 days after he'd confronted Richard and Patricia about wanting to acknowledge his daughter publicly. The courtroom erupted again, but I barely heard the chaos. The implications were staggering. Not only had my parents lied about my parentage, but they might have murdered my real father to protect their secret. Your Honor, Detective Santos's voice cut through the noise from the video screen. We're currently investigating Thomas Morgan's death as a potential homicide. Initial forensic review has revealed evidence of tampering with his vehicle's brake system. Patricia finally broke her silence, her voice shrill with desperation. This is insane! Thomas died in an accident. It was investigated and closed. Investigated by a police department where Richard Chen had significant political connections, David countered. The same police department that ruled the death accidental without conducting a thorough forensic examination. But why kill him? Judge Sandoval asked. If they'd already convinced him to stay quiet, because Thomas had decided to go public anyway, David explained. Margaret found his final letter in her papers after she died. He'd planned to acknowledge Sophia as his daughter and leave her his entire estate. Richard and Patricia couldn't allow that. It would have exposed their lies and cost them everything. I stared at the photograph David handed me next, a letter in handwriting I'd never seen before, dated just days before Thomas Morgan's death. The words blurred through my tears as I read my real father's thoughts about the daughter he'd never gotten to claim. Margaret, if something happens to me, please make sure Sophia knows that I loved her from the moment I learned of her existence. She deserves to know her real heritage, to inherit what I've built, to understand that she was wanted and cherished by someone who would have given anything to be her father publicly. Richard and Patricia have made it clear that they'll destroy anyone who threatens their perfect life. But some truths are too important to stay buried. Take care of my little girl. I broke down completely then, sobbing for the father I'd never known, for the life that had been stolen from me, for the 22 years of lies that had shaped every day of my existence. Sophia, David said gently, Margaret left you one more gift. Through my tears, I saw him hand me a thick envelope with my name written in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Inside were dozens of photographs. Thomas Morgan holding me as a baby, playing with me in Margaret's garden when I was too young to remember, looking at me with the kind of love I'd never seen in Richard's eyes. He visited you every week for the first 6 months of your life, David explained. Margaret documented every moment because she knew someday you'd want to know about your real father. As I looked at those photographs, at the man whose eyes were the same shape as mine, whose smile matched the one I saw in mirrors, I finally understood why Margaret had fought so hard to protect me. I wasn't just her granddaughter by marriage. I was the daughter of her beloved friend, the child of a love story that had been murdered along with the man who should have raised me. Richard and Patricia Chen spent 22 years living a lie, David concluded. They built their wealth on Margaret's trust, raised a child they knew wasn't theirs, and when that child became inconvenient, they planned to eliminate her entirely. This isn't an inheritance dispute, Your Honor. This is a criminal conspiracy spanning decades. Looking at my parents, the people who'd pretended to raise me while planning my death, I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. They weren't my family. They never had been. And now, finally, everyone would know the truth. 6 months later, I stood on the wraparound porch of Margaret's house, my house, watching the sunrise paint the Martha's Vineyard coastline in shades of gold and possibility. The legal battles were over, the criminals were in prison, and for the first time in 22 years, I knew exactly who I was. The trial had ended with Richard and Patricia in handcuffs, their carefully constructed lies crumbling under the weight of evidence that even Harold Hartwell couldn't explain away. The conspiracy charges had been just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into the Chen family finances, they'd uncovered decades of fraud, embezzlement, and manipulation that stretched back to before I was born. Patricia had been sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and accessory to homicide in Thomas Morgan's death. Richard had received 30 years, his sentence enhanced by the premeditation involved in planning my elimination, and the evidence that he'd personally tampered with my father's car all those years ago. Justice, it turned out, was sometimes just as thorough as the criminals who thought they could escape it. But the most profound changes hadn't happened in courtrooms or prison cells. They'd happened inside me. Learning that Thomas Morgan was my real father had reframed every memory, every moment of feeling like an outsider in my own family. I hadn't been the problem child who couldn't earn her parents' love. I'd been the living evidence of their deepest secrets, the reminder of crimes they'd committed and lies they'd told. The investigation had revealed that Thomas had left me everything in a will that Richard and Patricia had hidden and never probated. Combined with Margaret's inheritance, I was now worth over $60 million, more money than I could have imagined, but somehow less important than the truth that came with it. I'd spent months learning about my real father through Margaret's carefully preserved memories and the investigation files that had finally been released. Thomas Morgan had been everything Richard wasn't. Kind, honest, successful on his own merits, rather than through manipulation and theft. He'd built his wealth through innovative urban development projects that created affordable housing and community resources. He would have been so proud of you, Margaret had written in one of her final letters to me. Thomas always believed that character was more important than comfort, that doing right mattered more than doing well. You have his heart, Sophia, and his strength. Use them both to build something beautiful. I'd taken her words to heart. The Thomas Morgan Foundation was launching next month, dedicated to supporting teenagers who'd been abandoned or abused by their families. The scholarship program would ensure that kids like the 15-year-old girl I'd been would have somewhere to go and someone to believe in them. Elena Rodriguez, Margaret's former housekeeper who'd blown the whistle on my parents' murder plot, was now the foundation's first employee and my closest friend. She'd moved into the guest house and become the family I'd always needed, the older sister who protected me and believed in me unconditionally. "Good morning, mija," Elena called from the kitchen doorway, carrying 2 cups of the strong coffee that had become our daily ritual. "Good morning," I replied, accepting the warmth gratefully. "Any word from David? The book publisher called yesterday. They want to move the publication date up. Apparently there's more interest in your story than they expected." The book had been David's idea, a way to ensure that the truth about my family's crimes would be preserved and shared. From inheritance to independence, a true story of survival would be published next year, with all proceeds going to the foundation. "Any regrets?" Elena asked, settling into the chair beside me. I considered the question carefully. Did I regret the years of pain and confusion? The childhood spent feeling unwanted and unloved? The trauma of discovering that the people who'd raised me had planned my death? "No," I said finally. "Everything I went through led me here, to this truth, to this life, to understanding that some families are born from love, and some are built from choice, and the ones we build are often stronger." My phone buzzed with a text from Janet Morrison, the private investigator who'd become another unexpected friend. Richard's parole hearing denied. Patricia's appeal rejected. They'll both serve their full sentences. I felt a moment of satisfaction, followed by something that might have been pity. They'd chosen greed over love, lies over truth, and now they would spend the rest of their lives paying for those choices. But my story wasn't about them anymore. It was about the house that had sheltered me, the grandmother who'd protected me, and the father I'd finally gotten to know through photographs and letters, and the memories of people who'd loved him. As the morning sun climbed higher, warming the porch where I'd spent so many happy hours as a teenager, I thought about the 15-year-old girl who'd arrived here broken and desperate, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of questions. She'd deserved better than the people who'd raised her. She'd deserved to know that she was loved, wanted, and worthy of protection. She'd deserved to understand that family wasn't about biology or obligation. It was about choosing to show up for each other, day after day, with truth and kindness and unwavering support. Now, sitting in the home I'd inherited from the woman who'd saved me, managing the foundation built in honor of the father I'd never known, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love me unconditionally, I finally had all of that. I had more than survived my parents' betrayal. I'd transcended it. The girl who'd been thrown away at 15 had become a woman who would spend her life making sure no child ever felt abandoned again. The inheritance I'd fought for in court had become the foundation for helping others build their own lives of dignity and purpose. And the truth that had set me free would continue setting others free for generations to come. As I watched the waves crash against the shore below, I raised my coffee cup in a toast to the sunrise, to new beginnings, and to the unshakable knowledge that love, real love, always finds a way to win in the end. Margaret had been right about so many things, but she'd been most right about this. Some secrets are too big to stay buried forever, and justice, while sometimes delayed, is never truly denied. I was living proof of both.